This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of guys with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 265, People Powered. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we talk with Jono Bacon about his book, People Powered, which describes how communities can supercharge your business, brand, and teams. The book is full of resources to help you better your communities or start a community from the ground up. We're excited to talk in more detail with Jono about People Powered and communities in this day and age. Jono, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. I also love Drupal, by the way. So.
Well, that's great. We're going to talk a little bit about that later, but first, let's tell our audience a little bit about you. So you are a community and collaboration speaker, author, and podcaster. What's your podcast called?
So I greedily have two. One is called Conversations with Bacon, where I basically waffle with people for an hour about something interesting. And then I'm on another show called Bad Voltage with my two idiot friends, Stuart Langridge and Jeremy Garcia. And we just talk about open source and tech. So
that's funny because I'm on a show with my two idiot friends as well.
It's the new midlife crisis.
So Jono also served as the director of community for GitHub, Canonical, XPRIZE, and Open Advantage. He's the author of Art of Community and People Powered, founder of the Community Leader Summit, Conversations with Bacon, and co-founder of Bad Voltage, as you just heard. So, Jono, it's great to have you.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to be here. So how are you all doing? How are you surviving this coronavirus situation?
It's interesting. You know, I think obviously it's forced everybody to change their work from home status. But I would say it's interesting now that the kids are back at school. I'm surviving it a little bit better. Just talking this morning with somebody about like, when does that end? When do we get to the point where they're like, nope, they got to come back home and do the remote learning thing?
Yeah,
that's going to be
almost certainly going to happen. Right?
Yeah. So joining us as usual, we have Stephen Cross. Stephen, how are things going with you?
Great. Things are going well. Speaking of back to school, I think I mentioned this before. My wife is back, and unlike John, who's getting some pleasure out of being back to school, she's really having a hard time. She's in a classroom, and they're doing this hybrid where she's got half the class on Zoom. She's looking at them on a iPad, and then she's got half the class in front of her, and it is really, really challenging. So she's like a hero to me right now in what she's going through, and I hope things ease up. I really want, I would hate for kids to have to all go remote. It would be a lot easier on her if she was dealing with like kids that were all in one place, not in two places. So so that's pretty much with me. I've got some great computer stories. I think I'm going to save those for next week. For the listeners, we're a little behind on getting the last two shows out. That's because of some computer issues I've had, and those shows will be out shortly because I'm back up and running. So as of today. So I'll save my stories for next week.
As you can see by the fact that he's joining us.
Yes. True.
Also joining us, as usual, is Nick Laughlin. Nick, what's going on with you?
Good afternoon. Not too much, hanging in there. I just wanted to comment that I've been partnering with a new customer recently, and they have a different approach than most of my customers. They do a fair amount of RFPs, but they've been including me on the RFPs just to kind of do a quick glance. So I'm not having to like do a whole detailed discovery, but they just have me read over it. And I have to say, we did the RFP show maybe 2 months ago, but looking back, even just like the range of RFPs that I see is just so fascinating. Like from people with like a 2-line description to people that have, 15 pages in their RFP and include things like, we must be able to change every single font, color, or image on the front end with ease, or you need to do it for free for us. And it's like, okay, you clearly do not know how the internet works. But then the other half of that same RFP has extremely detailed requirements for particular features. And it's like, it's just very interesting to me to see how companies approach reaching out, looking for help.
It's also interesting they expect you to work for free. I guess they don't know how work works.
yeah, I kind of called that out and said, I'm not doing either of those options. I don't, unless they want to spend, 300 hours getting a horrible interface that allows them to change every last feature, and then they're just gonna, they'd be better served just using a different platform that has something like that built in.
Yes, RFPs are fun. Anyway,
so John, what's new with you?
What's new with me? I recently upgraded Thunderbird. So I use Thunderbird as my mail client. I know some people may have issue with that. And I recently upgraded it, and it totally borked my calendar. My calendar does not work now. The plugin that I'm using for calendar, basically just connects out to my Google Calendar, and totally broken. I went into they have a GitHub issue queue, and there are issues in there that are like, my calendar's broken. Like, what's going on? This thing's totally busted. So I was looking at different add-ons today, and there's one that actually so simple, so easy. And I'm just like, haven't I been doing this all along? It actually loads a Google Calendar tab in Thunderbird. So basically you're just using the Google Calendar interface through a tab in Thunderbird. I'm like, this is perfect. Why does that then be any harder than this? So started using that today. We'll see how it goes.
Is that why we didn't get invites for the meeting tonight?
It is. Yep, absolutely. So Stephen, Nick, and I are we organize a Drupal camp, and I sent out invites at the beginning of last week to everybody, thinking everybody got it. And I was like, hey, reminder, there's a meeting tonight. And everybody's like, what are you talking about, dude? There's no invite. Yeah, it's because I was adding attendees, saving the meeting, and it just was not happening. Anyway, it's enough about me. Let's move on to our primary topic. So, Jono, can you give our listeners just a brief overview of the book?
Yeah. So I guess the backstory here is about 10, 12 years ago, I wrote a book called The Art of Community. And I was working at Canonical at the time, and it ended up becoming a very kind of technical, hands-on book about how to build communities. It was essentially my approach that I'd learned up until that point in my career. But since then, especially since I started consulting, I worked with lots of different companies, and I'd have like executives and founders and whoever else reaching out and saying, we'd like to talk to you about working together. And then they'd say, I went and bought The Art of Community. I'm really looking forward to reading it. And I'd always have this slight cringe moment because the book is so detailed that my worry is that they'd read 5 or 10 pages and then be completely lost because it'd go into way too tactical levels of detail. It was also ended up becoming about 600 pages big because it went through 2 editions. Wow. So I knew I needed to write a book that was a bit more of a business book, a higher level, the kind of thing remember airports you could pick up at an airport and read on the plane. And that was going to be a couple of 100 pages, more generally applicable. And that was the goal of The Art of People Powered. But it turned into quite the process because when you write a business book, it's a very, very different writing experience. Writing for O'Reilly is you write the book, it gets edited, and then it's published. Whereas with a business book, you got to get an agent so you can even have a conversation with a publisher, and you've got to. The editing process took a year. It's very exhaustive. So it was just a very different experience. But I'm pretty proud of the outcome. People seem to like it so far. So,
who would you say is the primary audience for this book?
It's a good question, Nick. I mean, I think it's really people who. It's designed to be very general purpose. I think the people who are buying it the most are people who are either in a marketing role or a engineering role at a company, or they've founded a company, and they're seeing all of these communities around the world, like what's happening in open source. I mean, Drupal's a brilliant example of a fantastic community. They're looking at communities like Drupal and thinking, how do I do that? Like, where do I even start? And they don't really know what to do. And in many cases, they just want to understand enough about it so they can hire somebody intelligently to then go and build it out for them. So I think that's the primary audience. And of course, there's been a lot of community nerds and community managers and DevRel people who have bought it because they just enjoy the topic in general. So
you have a number of quotes in the book from people and organizations, companies like GitHub, Red Hat. You have Jamie, the co-host of Mythbusters. You have President Obama's press secretary. Have you worked with all of those people, or did you reach out to them to get content for the book?
Yes and no. So there's quotes and content within the book itself. So, for example, I put in a quote from Jim Whitehurst, who was at the time the CEO of Red Hat and is now, of course, president of IBM. Mm-hmm. And I just know Jim I was introduced to him through a friend of mine, and I've never really worked directly with him, but he's somebody who I've always respected his kind of perspectives on building communities. There are some people in there who I've worked much more directly with. So, for example, Jim Zemlin, the executive director of the Linux Foundation, like they've been a client of mine for a number of years. He's a friend of mine. And then there are just random people who I bumped into. So you mentioned Jamie, the co-host of Mythbusters. If I remember right, he emailed me when I was at Canonical and just said, "I love Ubuntu," and that was it. And then the kind of the biggest name, I guess you could say, is Joseph Gordon-Levitt. The Emmy award-winning actor. I ended up speaking at the Open Source Summit in LA, and they somehow wangled him to speak as well. So I was backstage preparing to go on, and he was there as well. And we ended up chatting. I had no idea that he set up this really cool community where artists kind of work together on the same project. Someone does the music, someone does the green screen, and whatever else. So I was astonished that he was even interested in talking to me, let alone getting on a phone call for half an hour to ask him a bunch of questions and then include it in the book.
So speaking of quotes and people who are quoted in the book, there's a quote from, again, this is a Drupal podcast, so most if not all of our listeners are going to know who Dries is. He says, "People Powered demystifies the art and science of how to build communities that work. It is essential reading for any organization." So have you worked with the Drupal community in the past, or are you currently working with them?
I'm not working with them right now. Not really. I mean, for example, Angie, like WebChick, her and I are friends, and we've talked a lot in the past about just what's been going on in Drupal, and mainly me listening, frankly, to what she's been doing in the community. I've known Dries for a number of years. I can't actually remember where I met him, but him and I have both got a mutual love of gin as well. So I've never really directly worked with Drupal. Most of the quotes that you see, like when you open up the front cover of People Powered, you'll see a ton of like endorsement quotes. And what I did basically was reached out to people who I know and respect, and basically said, "Can I send you a copy of the book? And if you like it, would you give me an endorsement? And if you don't like it, that's totally fine." And luckily, a lot of these people who I reached out to, got the book and read it and seemed to like it and thought it was useful. So
yeah, you reached out to a lot of people, and admittedly, I did not read all the quotes. I just skimmed through.
You don't need to.
I was like, "Oh, look, there's somebody I know. What do they have to say?" So.
Yeah, for up and coming writers. Pro tip: always ask people to read your book for endorsements, and you stick them in. People are more likely to buy your book if they feel like if other people like it, not just you. Right?
Makes sense. I've got a question that's particularly poignant for these times. As John mentioned, we help put together a local Drupal camp, which is part of community building, obviously. How do you think these communities have been affected by the pandemic?
It's a great question. I mean, unfortunately, I think it's got a pretty complicated answer because, I mean, there's no doubt that the pandemic has had a horrible impact on the planet. But I think while a lot of people have lost their jobs and have really struggled and have been wrestling with all of the challenges that we know of, like homeschooling and all the rest of it, I think where we have seen a bit of light popping out here is I think it's shone the light much more on people collaborating together online. Like a lot of businesses who didn't have any remote working, for example, were kind of pushed into remote working. And I've talked to a lot of people who work in companies, and they've said, we started this remote working thing, and then we actually found out that our staff started to enjoy it. And then they enjoyed kind of spending time with each other, but we had to be very intentional about how we did that. So I think the potential of communities has kind of has become more apparent. There is still a caveat of like people still, it's building communities is hard. It's really complicated, right? And I know you guys know a lot about how to do it, but like I think for most people, it's very, very difficult. But I think we've also been seeing, without using the cheesy word innovation too much, there has been a lot of innovation in different areas. So for example, people experimenting with virtual events and webinars and different types of content, just people getting into Zoom breakout rooms and experimenting. And I think sometimes adversity it can be a trigger for finding new things and discovering new things, as long as the adversity is manageable, right? So like an example of adversity that isn't manageable is, for example, systematic racism. Like that's not good, and it should never be good, and we should try and eliminate systematic racism. But I think, for example, saying, okay, how do we build a community when we were getting together in person? We can't now. I think it helps us to think in new and different ways. And I think we've seen some benefits to that.
I mean, do you have any tips for battling some of these issues like Zoom fatigue and what other, are there other concrete benefits that you see coming out of this long term aside from kind of maybe better work-life balance and remote working?
There's been kind of a lot of, I'm sure you've all seen all of this waffling on the internet about the world has forever changed when it comes to things like remote working, and that we're never gonna go back to in-person events and things like that. I don't believe that. I think human beings have short memories, and I think that once there is either we get some kind of herd immunity or there is a vaccine in sufficient numbers that the caseload goes down, I think people are going to start going back to events and things like that. But I think there'll be a hangover of, maybe this remote working thing is good, but we're just balancing it out with the in-person thing. You mentioned Zoom fatigue. I think this is a real problem. And I think one area where this has been interesting has been looking at how people have been doing virtual events. I put a tweet out 2 days ago where I talked about this. I don't think people want to go to virtual events all day. Like, I don't know about you guys, but I'm not going to sit at your virtual event, whatever it might be, for a whole day. And if I am sat there, I'm going to be doing my email while you're talking. So to me, there's a challenge there with grabbing people's attention. And I think some people have been taking the old model, which was, okay, you do a virtual event, it's basically a collection of webinars. And I don't think people want that. Like, I would much rather go to a virtual event where all of the sessions are 30 minutes long, 20 minutes of really practical content, kill all of the waffly, abstract, high-level keynotes. Nobody's interested in IBM's product pitch. Like, just focus on like learning really cool, practical content to help you with whatever you're doing. And I think when you frame it like that, it becomes a little more interesting. So I think we're starting to see like people experimenting and then seeing what works and what doesn't work.
So sort of related to this, we have in the book you talk about failure, slow adoption, low attendance at events. Yeah. And we in New England and primarily Providence, we have a local Drupal meetup that's a monthly event. And we've really struggled with getting people to show up and attend on a regular basis. Yeah. I'm wondering if you have any tips for dealing with that kind of situation.
I think one of the challenges with meetups that was already a challenge that's even worse now, frankly, with COVID, is that most of the meetups that I've ever been to, you'll have like a really good event. You show up, 6 o'clock, you'll have some pizza and beer, you'll watch a couple of talks, you'll get to chat to some people, and you have a great night, and then you go home. And then there'd be very little, if any, discussion in between those events. Mm-hmm. Then you'd meet 2 weeks later at another event, you'd have a great time. And to me, that's a real missing link. And meetup.com have tried to rectify this, I think, by, they've got, for example, built-in forums and whatever else and email in their platform. But I think communities need to be really intentional about the online piece. So to give you a comparison, when I started out in my open source journey, I went to university about a year after I discovered open source, and I set up a Linux user group in my town in Wolverhampton. And set up a mailing list, right? Because that's what you did in the late 90s, early 2000s in open source. Set up a mailing list. So we'd meet in a pub every 2 weeks to go and have dinner and a couple of beers and talk about Linux. But it was the online piece, the mailing list, that really glued us together. So I'd say the most important thing is going to be really focusing on building a central place where your community will kind of get together online. And that could be an email list, it could be an IRC channel, a Slack channel, it could be a forum, whatever's best for your members. But really focus on that. So then it's a real community. It's not just a collection of events that happen one after the other, which is in itself valuable, but I think it just adds a lot more. People really get to know each other. They can share ideas about talks that they can deliver and things like that. So
you lay out a pretty comprehensive plan for building communities in your book. So people that want a deeper dive should definitely pick up a copy. But can you kind of give a high level, what's the bullet point list of people that are looking to build a community around something that they should consider?
Yeah. So the first step, I think, is you got to pick your mission, your goal. Like, what do you want to do? So, you mentioned as an example, like a Drupal group. This could be getting people together to share skills and, get to know each other and just improve their overall usage of Drupal, for example. And then I think the next step is then figuring out, okay, what is the value that my prospective members are going to want, right? So for example, again, using the Drupal group as an example, it's probably going to be learning skills, techniques, and approaches for how to use Drupal more effectively. Maybe related skills such as how do I build great content? How do I do social media? How do I do search engine optimization? So you figure out like what your audience really wants. Because the thing about communities is there's the old kind of cliche of if you build it, they will come. And I think most of us know that that's not the case. What does get people through the door is just raw value, things that are interesting to them. So for example, one of the reasons why webinars have become a very popular technique to get people into businesses and whatever else is because a webinar is all about delivering value for an hour. It's like give you something really concrete for an hour. So it's easy for people to sign up because it's worth it. But just saying, hey, come and join my Drupal community or come and join my other community, that alone won't get most people through the door. You've got to give them something really concrete in terms of value. And then I think what you do is a community goes through like 3 phases. You start out as a casual member. So you make it really easy for them to join and get involved. Make sure the onboarding is really simple. And then when they start as a casual member, they don't really know anyone. They haven't really figured it out. They've got a lot of imposter syndrome. They don't know if it's worth their time. So keep giving them value over and over again. And as they experience more and more of that value, it takes about 2 months to build a habit in anything. So after about 2 months, they'll become regulars. And that means they'll be showing up all the time. So again, if you have like a Drupal community, people will be on your mailing list. They'll be coming to your events. They'll be coming to your virtual events. You'll just get to know them. You'll see them. They'll become part of the furniture, part of the community. And then a small number of those people will become core members. They'll be the people who are really, really excited about the community and going the extra mile to help people be successful. When people become regulars, the key there is that you try to encourage their creativity. So they can say, oh, wouldn't it be cool if we did this, or if we did this, or if we did this? And when people start thinking like that, the community feels like their own, and they enjoy that. The way in which we move people from the casual to the regular to the core is with incentives. We give them reasons to participate and spend time there. And that could be consuming that value, but it could also be working on cool things. Like, let's say, Stephen, you decide, I'm going to run a hackathon, right? And John says, I'll help with the hackathon. Maybe I'll, put together the registration form. And then Nick says, well, I think this sounds cool. I'll come and help out with this. And then before you know it, the community's generating content and value to bring even more community members in. And that's kind of how it tends to flow.
So if you've read these principles, you think you're good to go. Is this something you can do kind of on the side? What if you're not, you're lucky to kind of community is your,
it's my
livelihood. It sounds like it's your job. But for a lot of people in a lot of communities, that's not true. How do you make sure you're kind of hitting all the marks if it's, just kind of part of your passion?
The great news about communities is that they're as long as a piece of string, So, for example, when I started learning about this stuff, all of the community stuff that I was doing was in my spare time. I had a full-time job doing other stuff. And I think it's a better time than ever for building communities because so many more people are on the internet. There's so much more access to information, things like content on YouTube and Medium and whatever else. The tools are cheaper, more accessible than ever before. So I think the key thing is just getting started and doing something, and then just, watching how it goes, and then improving and making changes and growing it bit by bit. For example, as a consultant, I've worked with some companies where they have part of one person's time on the community, and they can do a lot less. But then they need to be working really efficiently to make the very most of that, half time each week. And then I've worked with some companies, like one, for example, in Asia, they hired 15 community managers, full time to work on their community. Oh, wow. And it really can. And that's largely what I tend to do as a consultant is say, okay, what do you want to achieve? And what resources have you got? Okay, how do we figure out how to get to a point where you can build a community, and then your community can start playing a role, and they start becoming a resource for you as well. So the good news is, like I say, it can be as long as a piece of string. So.
I'm kind of curious about the other side of it.
Yeah.
And what kind of thinking you've done around this? Like, how do you ensure you're just a good community member per se? So, because you can only be kind of a core member. It sounds like of so many groups. You can't be a core member of like 35 different communities. You
wouldn't have time. Yeah.
You wouldn't have time. But how do you, if you are part of a community, how do you ensure that you're, a good community member that's not just, taking everything and not giving any value back?
So I think there's kind of two threads to this. One is just, this is going to sound like a cop-out, honestly, but just being a good person, so showing up and participating, being kind, being empathetic towards people, being collaborative, just when you think of the people you enjoy working with, just being that person in terms of an active participant, I think is always the baseline. And that's easier said than done, right? Because culturally, where things vary in different age groups, in different parts of the world, in different industries, we all have different norms. And the community is a bit of a melting pot of those. So that's where I think the community leaders need to be able to say, okay, this is what we define as our norm, as our culture. And the tricky thing about culture is you can't force culture on someone, right? A culture is a set of norms that the group have just decided is okay. So, I could, for example, right now, leave my house, run onto the street completely naked and run around shrieking. But culturally, that's weird where I live. People don't tend to do that, and it's probably illegal as well. So that our culture has decided that's not okay to do that, right? So in the same way that it's not okay to go and watch a movie and then start shouting in the middle of the movie, it's just not okay to do that. So I think one element is fostering that. But the second piece, I think, what goes into being a good member is always finding opportunities to add value to the group. So one of the reasons why I think community is so powerful, and we can use Drupal as a good example of this. Like the reason why Drupal is so amazing is because so many people have made it amazing, right? And it's not just writing code; it's testing, it's documentation, it's translations, it's running groups, it's helping people solve their problems. So I think waking up in the morning and think, how do I be of service to my fellow community members, is always a wonderful trait in people. And not everybody has that natural inclination. Okay. To your point earlier on, Nick, like it varies, like there'll be some communities where you are that you want to I just want to make this as amazing as possible. Whereas others, you're like, okay, I'm happy to just be a passerby, So I think those are the critical things.
So this is going to be a very straightforward question. Why do you care so much about communities, and why do you think they're important?
Yeah, it's a great question. For me, there's, again, kind of two reasons, I think. The reason why I care about them is that I find them infinitely interesting. When I first got into this, my brother installed Linux on my PC in 1998, Slackware 96. and wrote the username and password on a Post-it note and left. So I had to try and figure out how to use Linux.
Sounds like something Steven would do.
And I bought a book, and it was, first chapter was how Linux is built and kind of the open source movement. And I was fascinated by this. And what was interesting to me was, how does that work? How do you mix together like the systems and the workflow and the incentives? And every time you peel back a little bit more of the puzzle, there's a whole new Rubik's Cube buried in there to figure out. And I find that really interesting. I really enjoy, I don't actually like puzzles, like jigsaws. I find them boring, but I like figuring out how systems kind of get glued together. So it's a game that never has a ultimate end conclusion, which I find interesting. But the other reason, and the more altruistic side, which frankly has become more and more of a thing, especially since I left university, is I just think communities make the world a better place. Is that I think when we form together, we're a social species. When we get together into groups and we have the same, passion and ethos. I mean, I'm sure it's the same thing with you guys in Drupal, right? Like, Drupal isn't just a technology; it's your culture. It's where you've met so many friends and you spend time with each other. And there's the in jokes and there's the, all those different elements. It's not just productive with Drupal, it's fun and it's engaging. And so many people will have built careers from their participation in the Drupal community and had families and all kinds of stuff. So to me, what's amazing about it is it makes the world a better place, is that we're better together, I think, in constructive communities. I mean, some people obviously form together into communities that are destructive, which is not good. But I think that I look at a community as like a network of minds, right? I mean, just take this group here, right? There's 4 of us chatting right now. The level of combined expertise and insight and experience and time available with the 4 of us is so much more powerful than any one of us. And I think that's what's so powerful about communities, is that in most businesses, for example, you pay someone for their time and their expertise, and that's it. And that's the extent of the resources that you've got. If we were a business of 4 people, this will be our entire set of resources. But when you've got a community and they feel empowered, they then become part of your resourcing. They can create content and material and whatever else. So it's infinitely interesting to me. So
this actually and Nick's previous question sparked something in my brain. So I'm gonna ask you, in any community, somebody, people are giving their time, they're, trying to put their best foot forward. Inevitably, they'll do something, right? Especially in open source, people just like randomly do stuff all the time. They'll do something, They'll put something out there in the community, and, there'll be in my notes here, I call them naysayers or negative Nancy's.
Right.
How do you combat against that? You want people to keep trying to innovate and to do their best. And, there are going to be people in the community that don't really feel like their best is good enough. How do you balance that?
Other than community shaming, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that there's, again, there's 2, I think it's the rule of 2s, right? There's always 2 things, which I discovered from my friend Stuart. I think one element here is designing kind of workflow and collaboration to protect against that as much as possible. So if we look at open source, for example, I think one of the reasons why open source has been so successful is because it's completely normal that if you want to contribute code into a project, first of all, you all work from the same code base, but you also, you create your pull request and you submit it. And then the norm is that people will review your pull request openly and provide feedback in the pull request. And then if they're happy with it, then they'll merge it into the main branch. So the culture protects against things like the IKEA effect, which is a psychological effect where we overvalue our own creations. So people think that what they do is way better than it actually is. And the benefit of having that peer review process, for example, means that it kind of mitigates around that, because the norm is that you are going to expect that someone's going to contribute, like look at your pull request and make sure that it works for the project. So it kind of lessens the blow, I think, in some ways. So I think good workflow, open workflow is really critical. In so people can see how the process works. So, I think in well-run projects, you're always going to have grumpy, miserable people. Like I don't think you can get rid of that. But I think you need to have a culture that basically says collaboration is completely normal. I think the second piece is great leadership, because we, again, psychologically mimic our leaders. So if you've got a great leader who is kind and empathetic and collaborative, typically people will mimic that leader and in their own behavior. I'm not sure if you guys have experienced this, but I have. When you've worked for a company where the boss, where the person at the top of the tree is extremely aggressive and very unkind, other people will mimic those behavioral elements because they think that's what they need to do to get ahead. This is one of my biggest gripes with portions of corporate America, is in some boardroom tables, frankly, being an a-hole is normal, and that's okay. And it isn't okay. So I think the good leadership is important. So I think when you combine the good leadership with open collaboration, it means that people get to see that good leadership. They get to see how people react in those situations, and therefore they're more likely to have the right kind of behavioral elements. And then, of course, you just need good moderation. Like there's got to be a clear line where you can say, you know what, I don't care if you're the best programmer in Drupal. Your behavior is unacceptable. Like, you cannot speak to other people like that and treat them like that. It's not okay. And that's another thing that, without wishing to say this too much to America, I think that I've met a lot of people over the years who say, he's a real a-hole, but he's so good at what he does. It's like, don't care. Just don't care. Not interested. I don't care how good you are. If you're unkind and nasty to people, you don't have my respect. Put it that way.
And Linus Torvald has had that sort of
right
coming out in the past couple of years, where he's admitted that he's been an a-hole to people and has tried to better himself as a community leader.
That was interesting because I wouldn't say I know him particularly well, but I'd always see him at the open source summits and we'd have a chat or whatever. Yeah. And he's very different in person than online. Online, it's like, whoa, prepare yourself.
Yeah.
And I think he realized through some pressing that some things needed to change,
Yeah, and I remember reading too, not to excuse his behavior, but I remember reading an article maybe a year or two ago that talked about some of the it's the internet effect. They magnify the negative, and some of the particularly nasty Linus rants were directed at people that were very experienced in the community and were doing things that were very contrary to the project's needs and wants.
Yeah.
But like I said, not to excuse his tone, like you can always address things with a better tone, but and he certainly has a reputation, but I think that was something that was very interesting to me to see how, I mean, the Linux community at that level operates differently than a lot of other communities too. I think like it's still going through mailers. I mean, it always surprises me at how awful the mailing list websites are. You go there and it's just like a white page with a wall of text, and you have to kind of parse what's going on. And it's but there's people that live and die by those.
Well, I thought what was also interesting about the Linus situation was it raised a question, I think, for a lot of people around the path to redemption. So I think there were and are some people that are of the view Linus was an extremely toxic participant in the Linux kernel, and therefore that's it. He shall never ever be accepted, no matter what he does. And I think people do change. I think we need to accept bad behavior where it happens and not excuse it, to your point, Nick. But I do think we need to give people an opportunity to right their wrongs. And I think overall, from what I've seen, Linus has made a lot of changes that have been very positively received. But I do think we need to give people a chance to do that. So,
and that's not just in communities. That's like globally, right? Just
generally, yeah.
I think as people, I think I was talking to my wife about this, or I was talking to somebody about it the other day, and we just don't. We're very good at holding grudges and not giving people a chance to make a mistake and say, "Hey, that's okay." You can make a mistake. Anyway.
Yeah. I agree. And the first step there is apologizing, right? Is saying, you know what? I'm really sorry. I was doing it all wrong. Because people do screw up. I mean, I screw up every day.
John,
Right
we've talked a lot today about open source. And it seems like, from what I can see, the term community manager has been more prominent in the open source world and seems to be coming now more is part of maybe corporate America, the concept of a community leader. So I'm wondering what your thoughts on the differences between open source community and non-open source community.
Yeah, it's a really good, really fantastic question, Stephen. I mean, I think one element is that open source, frankly, is just weird in the broader community setting. I think for many years, and I was certainly guilty of this, we thought, because we've been doing community for so long in open source, we thought, well, this is how communities work. But outside of the open source engineering, especially the engineering mindset, open source is a very unusual way of working. Most other communities that aren't in tech don't have the level of peer review and open discussion and open governance and collaboration and all these different pieces that are very familiar to us. So we're not as special. Well, actually, I'd say we're more special than we might think we are in terms of how that works. I think one element of this is the benefit that we've got in open source is that I think most people who are in the open source world, even if they don't know a lot about community, they know that the community is at least half of the reason why it's really powerful. The code is important. I would actually say that it's more important than the code. Whereas I think in a lot of other communities, you don't have that level of central importance to what's going on, right? So, someone joins the Lululemon community, they're probably going to be primarily interested in fitness and athletic wear and whatever else. It's not going to be necessarily just the community piece. So community is kind of part of the product that we've got in building open source. Like you can't run an open source project unless it's got a community in it, right? So even if it's a small community. So, I think that's the key thing. The other element as well that's a big difference is one of the reasons why I think open source has been so successful is because you can be a very, very successful participant in open source and live wherever you want to within a reasonable degree. Like if you're living in very rural parts of Africa, there may not be internet access and all that kind of stuff. But it's not like if you want to be in a, mechanical engineering community where you need a shop, like you don't need a shop to participate in open source. You need a computer and an internet connection and some time and, some skills, right? So I think the barrier to entry is lower in some ways. I've tried building communities, for example, around hardware, and it's just very, very difficult because it's not, it's just very difficult to collaborate together. You really need to be in person, and then that limits your available potential audience.
One thing that was kind of interesting is that in the book you share your contact info a couple different times. I was curious, how much correspondence do you get from that?
A lot.
Really?
I think, yeah. Well, and because I don't just share my contact details in the book, I share it like fairly widely. It's very important to me. Like my email address, jono@jonobacon.com. Everyone's welcome to email me. The reason why is I really want a genuine relationship with my audience. There's some people, they write books and then they don't talk to their readers. And in the same way that there's some people who have email lists and they only ever send email to their recipients. They never ever actually respond, or it's impossible to respond because you get it from noreply@domain.com. That's where the emails come from. I think that's the wrong way to do things, So it means a lot of email. I probably spend at least 2 to 3 hours a day sending and receiving email.
Interesting.
But I think it really builds a good relationship. I'll give you an example. So one of the things I love doing is just sending really valuable stuff to people via email. So people can go to jonobacon.com/join. And when you sign up, I don't send people a lot of sales stuff. It's just, here's how to onboard people, and here's free copies, here's free chapters from my book, and here's, a podcasting getting started guide and templates and all kinds of stuff. I sent an email out about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and it just said, "Hey everyone, what's in your mind right now?" And I got probably 50 responses within 25 minutes. It was ridiculous. All kinds of different things. You know, some people were worried about getting their new job. They've been furloughed. Some people were trying to figure out how to start an open source project. And then there's a great little tool called Loom that you may have seen, where you can basically record a little video, and it saves it to a link immediately. It's not like recording a video and putting it up on YouTube. So, you know, I could record like a 2-minute video response and then just send them the link to the Loom link. And I did that for about 20 of them. And I got these wonderful responses from people saying, first of all, whenever I've signed up for anyone's email, I've never had anyone ask me how I'm doing. Secondly, when I responded to that email, I've never had anyone actually respond to me with a video message. And I think what it does is, even though I couldn't necessarily do that with everybody, people then start sharing that story, and it builds a culture around, you know, this is how we're going to engage with that guy. And that's what I think community should be doing, is you make that level of just participation really fundamental to it, you know.
It's like a reset almost, right? To
Yeah,
the expectation. Right. Like they're like, I'm going to send this email. Nobody's ever going to reply back to me. Not only did you reply back, but you replied back with a video. And they're like, okay, well now my expectations reset a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. Because there's so much crap that people get through email. It's all like promotional material. Ugh, it's garbage.
That's for sure.
When I sent the email to you asking you to join the show, I think you responded within 3 or 4 hours, and it was like, "Yes, I'd love to." There were no questions. It was that simple. Yes, I'd love to.
I honestly thought that Steven was pulling my leg when he's like, "Oh yeah, we're gonna have Jono on the show in like September," and I'm like, "Okay, like take it easy. I'm reading the book. All right, I'm reading the book."
The pressure's on.
Right.
Speaking of the book again, we've had a couple of different authors on the show. I think longtime listeners know Jason, who used to be a co-host. He wrote a book on web topography. I think we had Caesar Abadi on to talk about a project management book he had written. And so I'm curious if you would recommend writing a book, and maybe a little bit about what your process was. You said it kind of changed between different books that you've written.
Yeah, a lot. I think writing a book is a really rewarding experience, but be prepared for a brutal amount of work. It's always way harder than you ever expect it's going to be. And I remember that my first editor mentioned that to me. You know, she said, you think it's going to be easy? It isn't. It's going to be hard. But I think it's really rewarding because it's an opportunity to distill your thoughts down, whatever you're writing about, into a form that people can read in one go, or, you know, over one period of time. And then you have like a shared conversation. Like people will be able to reach out to me and say, "Hey, I read this chapter." And then they can ask questions about that. And it's a great way to build a relationship with people. It's also just a good way to kind of obviously build, like, I hate the term personal brand, but you know what I'm saying? Like people knowing who you are. And as a consultant, I certainly get business that comes in through the books, but that's not the reason why I write them. The process, I think, I don't know this because I've talked to some authors, but not a lot of authors about how they do it. But I think I'm unusually disciplined. And I don't mean that in a braggadocious way. It's just when I start writing a book, so I'll give you an example. When I wrote People Powered, because it's for a business publisher, HarperCollins, it takes forever to sign the contract. It takes forever to edit it. And then you've only got 4 months to write the book. Right? So the actual writing period is extremely compressed. And I was so terrified about screwing it up because, like, wow, I've got a book contract with HarperCollins. It's a big deal for me as a writer. I want to make sure that it's perfect. So I was petrified that I was going to be late or submit a manuscript that they weren't going to like. So what I did is I basically calculated, okay, I want to get this written in 3 months. So my final manuscript, and then I want to send it out to a bunch of people who I know and trust to give me feedback so I can do my own edit before I then send it into HarperCollins and they go through their editing process. So what I did is I basically figured out how many pages do I need to write each day. In a business book, it's about 400 words a page. And I had to read something like 2 or 3 pages, write 2 or 3 pages a day. And then I tracked that in a Google spreadsheet with a burn down chart. So I knew that so long as everything was under the line, if I If I was under the line, then I knew I was on track. I actually ended up writing the book, the first draft of the book, in 8 weeks.
Wow.
Wow.
Because I was so, if I'm being honest with you, I was so terrified of screwing it up that I just went gangbusters on it. I was writing every evening. I was up until 2:00 in the morning writing most days. And what I'd learned over the years was the first time you write the first manuscript, just get it down. Don't try and make every word perfect because you'll catch that in editing. And then got to that 8-week period, and I was looking at my burn down chart, thinking, good grief, I'm way ahead of schedule. So I then sent it out to 10 people who read it, and I was very clear and said, like, tell me where it sucks. I'd love to hear where you like it, but I really want to know how it sucks. And there was lots of like little bits of commentary that helped me to fix it. But the real challenge with People Powered, as opposed to the Art of Community, was the Art of Community was a tech book for the business, for the tech press, and you can be much more liberal in terms of word count. If it went over a bit, it didn't really matter. Whereas with the business press, you have to hit that number of pages, and it's actually not. It's like 65,000 words. It's not a lot of. It might sound like a lot of words, but to get the full thesis of what I wanted to write into that amount of space was difficult. The other thing that I discovered as well, and for people who are thinking about writing books, if you go to write a business book, it's a little different. You have to write a really big proposal. So my proposal for People Powered was 35 pages long. I spent 6 months working on it. And then I found my agent, and she was like, this is terrible. You need to redo it. But with O'Reilly, it was like, I wrote a 2-page overview, and they were like, sure, that sounds good. But I already had a bit of a relationship with them. But breaking it down into like, this is the sketch outline of the book was really important. And then I just went and peppered each of the chapters with kind of the chapter title, like the headings that I want to use. So most of the headings that you actually see in People Powered were from my outline. And then I just went and filled in the content. And that was nice, because then I could feel like I was making progress.
I have to say, the most interesting thing to me about that is that your process to writing it and John's process to reading it were exactly the same.
That's fascinating.
I have to read or write 3 pages a day to be on target.
I was actually thinking, crap, I got to learn how to read faster. You wrote this book in 8 weeks. It took me four to read it. Like, what?
And the other side of that is it took you 3 times as long to write the proposal as it did to write the actual book.
Yeah.
Like that's fascinating to me. Not something I would have thought.
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, for example, when I wrote the proposal, it was all about the book, and my agent Margot said, "You're in a different world now. You're talking to the business press. You got to lead with you, and then the book is something that you're producing." Which was, for anyone who's seen my social media, people wouldn't imagine that I'd be uncomfortable talking about myself. But that was weird, because I have this Britishism about not wanting to sound like too flashy or anything like that. So that was. It's an interesting experience. So,
as we start to wrap up here, I got 2 quick questions for you at the end. So, as an open source advocate, and you have worked at Canonical, sounds like your first computer was Linux. What operating system do you use today as your daily driver?
Oh, I'm going to start disappointing large swathes of your audience right now.
I know what's happening.
I use a Mac.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry everyone.
You don't have to be sorry. I use a Mac too.
You don't have to be sorry. Just ashamed.
Boom! Wow, I like that. I'm going to use that. You don't have to be sorry. Just ashamed.
And that totally distracted me from my last question. My last question was this. Do you think if you're trying to build a community that you need to get involved heavily with social media?
I think it helps. The majority of inbound traffic to websites is from social media and organic search. So I think if you can talk about your community and what you're doing on social media and get people excited, it's going to raise awareness of your community and get people in the same way that having a good website, hopefully using Drupal, and good SEO is going to be important when people go and try and find what you're doing and they stumble on it through Google. So Yeah, I think it's important. What I don't think is important is to make it all about social media. People are obsessed with social media too much. It's important, but it's not that important. So,
Okay, so hey, if you have any questions or feedback, you can reach out to us on Twitter at Talking Drupal. And we do have a Talking Drupal channel on the Drupal Slack, and you can also email us at show@talkingdrupal.com. You can also get show updates by signing up for our newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
We'd also like to take a moment to thank our patrons for supporting Talking Drupal. Thank you for the couple of new patrons that joined this past week. The main benefit for our patrons is they get a little bit of the pre-show and post-show in a raw personal feed. If you want to learn more about becoming a patron, you can go to talkingdrupal.com and choose the Become a Patron button.
Jono, it's been great having you.
Thank you.
It's awesome to be able to read a book, enjoy reading a book, and then talk to the guy who wrote it. So that's been super great.
Well, I appreciate you having me on. This is a lot of fun. So,
well, feel free to come back anytime.
Careful what you wish for.
Is there anything that we've missed? Anything you think we should share with our listeners?
I don't think so. I mean, there's two things going on. I don't know when you're going to put this out, but there's one thing I am doing is a book club where people can actually read a chapter a week. I think similar to how you've been doing it, John. And then I'm going to be doing a weekly session where people can ask questions, and reading the book as part of a community, which is kind of cool. It's actually an idea from the community that's really kind of taken hold, and that the deadline for registrations is the 2nd of October. That's going to start on the 6th of October. So you can go to jonobacon.com and find out how to do that. And then I'm also going to be doing a webinar in October about how to create great content and how you can create like blog posts and videos and social media and all that kind of stuff. And there's more information on the website there too.
So I know that you can find the 25 references within the book to your email address, but if our listeners want to contact you or learn more about you, how can they go about doing that?
Yeah, so email is Jono, Jono, like Bono, but without the talent. Jono@jonobacon.com. And then I have such a stupid name that I'm on most of the social media networks as well. Apart from there's some imposter called Jono Bacon on Instagram, so I'm Jono Bacon Gram on there. But I didn't quite make the Instagram generation, so I don't really go on there very much. So.
All right. Well, Nick, if people wanted to contact you via the social media or the internet, how would they go about doing that?
You can find me pretty much everywhere online at NixVan, NICXVAN. And I just want to say it's been great having you on, but I don't know if you know this, but John, Steven, and I actually met at a book club, doing a web design book club that Steven I think used to run.
I wasn't a really active member of that either. So
John,
he never read the book.
John showed up every week for the book club, always had something to say, but never read the book.
I was there for the community and not so much for the reading aspect.
There you
What can I say? Stephen, tell our listeners how they can contact you.
Oh, same as always, at Stephen Cross with a PH on Twitter.
And as always, I'm John Picozzi. You can find me on all the major social networks and Drupal.org at John Picozzi. And if you want to find out more about Oomph, you can find out about us at oomphinc.com.
As always, if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. See you guys next week.
See you guys.
Have a good one.